July 1943, 07:30 hours, Central Iowa. The bus doors groaned open. Heat poured in, heavy with the smell of cut hay and ripening corn. 40 German prisoners, most captured in North Africa only months before, shuffled down the steps under the gaze of 2 U.S. Army guards. The men expected to see barbed wire, watchtowers, punishment. Instead, before them stretched something that left them stunned into silence. Fields. Miles of fields. Corn stalks rising taller than a man, wheat bending in the wind, barns painted red and white like something from a picture book. In the distance, a tractor growled, its massive wheels chewing through the soil. A boy of perhaps 12 sat on the fence rail, watching with curiosity. An older farmer, overalls stained with sweat, tipped his hat as the soldiers disembarked. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Bremer, age 23, later told an interrogator, "I thought they were mocking us. We were prisoners, yet here were civilians, women and children, watching us like neighbors. We had been told Americans were soft, lazy, incapable of order. But the fields, they were endless. No village in Germany had so much food in one place. The US government had begun moving German POWs inland only weeks before. The camps were filling rapidly. By the end of the war, over 425,000 German prisoners would be scattered across the United States, more than twice the number sent to Britain. The Geneva Convention permitted agricultural labour, provided the men were compensated. The army arranged contracts. Farmers paid Washington for the hours. The POWs received scrip they could spend on cigarettes, soap, or writing paper at the camp canteen. What shocked the Germans first was not the labour, but the setting. In North Africa, capture meant sand, dust, hunger, and endless lines of barbed wire. Here, in America's heartland, they were put on buses and driven into the countryside. Some believed it was a trick, that they were being paraded before civilians as propaganda. But when the guards ordered them to line up by the barn and the farmer approached with work gloves in hand, the reality became unavoidable. They were not being punished. They were being hired. For decades, Nazi propaganda had painted American agriculture as chaotic, disorganized, and wasteful. Posters distributed in 1941 showed obese capitalists presiding over crumbling fields, black sharecroppers picking cotton under chains, machines rusting from disuse. Joseph Goebbels' ministry insisted that the United States could not feed itself, much less a war. Germany, they proclaimed, possessed the true farmer's spirit. Blut und Boden, blood and soil. But what the POWs saw in July 1943 contradicted every image. A single Iowa farm boasted barns larger than some German factories. Granaries were so full that corn spilled onto the ground, left for chickens to pick at. Milk cooled in metal tanks powered by electricity. Even the farmer's wife, apron tied at her waist, worked with efficiency. She moved crates of eggs into a truck while her teenage daughter poured fresh milk for the guards. One prisoner muttered, "This cannot be America. This is a dream." Another replied, "If this is a dream, why are we the ones in chains?" The bus had travelled 90 miles from Camp Algona that morning. Algona itself housed nearly 10,000 Germans, a small city of prisoners built almost overnight on farmland leased from Iowan families. The men lived in barracks, ate hot meals, and were issued uniforms stenciled PW. Rumours spread quickly through the camp. Some prisoners claimed they had eaten better in Iowa than as soldiers in Rommel's Afrika Korps. The army had a problem. By 1943, millions of young American men were overseas. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh absorbed more workers every month. The Women's Land Army filled some gaps, but the harvest loomed. Wheat, corn, sugar beets, fruit, the lifeblood of both the home front and the front lines. The War Manpower Commission authorized the use of POW labor under strict conditions. By the end of the harvest season, more than 90,000 Germans would be working the fields, from Texas cotton to Michigan apples. Farmers were told, treat them fairly, keep them under guard, and remember the Geneva Convention. The prisoners' expectations had been shaped by scarcity. In Germany, rationing had begun in 1939. Civilians received 200 grams of meat per week, 50 grams of butter, ersatz coffee made of acorns. By 1942, bread was stretched with fillers, ground potato, sometimes even sawdust. Many of the men arriving in Iowa had marched through Russian villages where peasants fought over scraps of mouldy bread. Now they stood watching as an American farmer poured buckets of grain into a trough, not for people, but for pigs. The animals ate more in one morning than a German soldier saw in a week. Unteroffizier Otto Hempel later recalled, "In Germany you would guard a sack of flour with your life. Here, sacks were stacked to the roof, unattended. The waste was shocking. We saw children throw half-eaten apples away. I had to turn my head. The guards called the men into groups of 10 and handed out tools, scythes, hoes, grain sacks. At first, the prisoners hesitated. They expected sabotage, resentment, humiliation. Instead, the farmer simply gestured toward the rows of corn. His words were plain. We need the work done. You work, you eat, and they worked. Hours passed under the sun. Sweat soaked their shirts. The farmer's son, no older than 14, worked alongside them, swinging a scythe with surprising skill. By noon, the wife appeared with food, sandwiches stacked in wax paper, jars of milk kept cool in the well, slices of apple pie. The prisoners stared in disbelief. Food, real food, handed to enemy soldiers in the middle of a war. One man whispered, "This is more than my wife has seen in months." Another, bolder, asked the guard if he could take a second sandwich. The guard shrugged. "Go ahead." Plenty more where that came from. The abundance was not simply material. It was psychological. The Germans had been raised on discipline, scarcity, and fear of authority. Yet here, in the supposed enemy's homeland, they saw farmers smiling, children laughing, and food shared freely even with captives. The contradiction gnawed at them. If America was weak, how did it produce such plenty? If its people were decadent, why were its farms so efficient? In the evening, when the prisoners were loaded back onto the bus, their hands blistered and stomachs full, the silence was heavier than in the morning. Some stared out the windows at the fields glowing in the sunset. Others sat with eyes closed, chewing slowly on memories of bread, meat, and milk. Lieutenant Bremer wrote in his diary that night, "Today I saw the truth. Germany fights with pride and sacrifice, but America fights with abundance. We measure in grams, they measure in bushels. We dream of bread, they feed it to animals. How can we win?" The first encounter with American agriculture was more than work duty. It was revelation. Each jerry can of gasoline in Europe, each ration card in Berlin, each hollow face in Hamburg stood in contrast to barns overflowing in Iowa, to milk poured without thought, to sandwiches given to prisoners. The Germans had entered captivity expecting humiliation. What they found was worse for their faith in the Reich. Evidence that their enemy's strength lay not in cruelty, but in an industrial, agricultural, and human abundance that dwarfed everything they had known. And this was only the beginning. Spring 1943. Across the American heartland, anxiety took root not in the soil, but in the ledgers of county agents and the crowded meeting rooms of agricultural boards. The wheat was nearly ready, the corn planting season loomed, and the orchards of Michigan and California swelled with blossoms that would soon demand labor to harvest. But when the rosters were called, entire generations of farmhands were missing. 2 million farm workers had left the fields since 1941. Some had traded plows for rifles, shipped to North Africa, Sicily, and the Pacific. Others had gone to Detroit, Buffalo, and Pittsburgh, lured by double wages in defense plants. Still others were women, now working 12-hour shifts in aircraft assembly, leaving less time to help with milking or planting. The result was a vacuum, and the crops did not wait for war. The War Manpower Commission confronted a paradox. America was producing more food than at any time in its history, but lacked the hands to harvest it. From 1940 to 1944, U.S. corn yields rose from 2.5 billion bushels to over 2.7 billion. Wheat climbed to 1.2 billion bushels. Meatpacking plants processed millions of cattle and hogs. Yet behind every statistic lay a problem: fields that needed harvesting, livestock that needed tending, orchards that needed ladders and baskets. By mid-1943, newspapers carried stories of peaches rotting on the ground in Georgia, sugar beets left uncut in Colorado, apples falling unpicked in Washington state. "The war," wrote one Iowa farmer in his diary, "is not won only on the battlefields, but in these rows. Without labor, our harvest will collapse and the soldiers will starve." Washington searched for solutions. First came the Bracero program, bringing Mexican workers north under bilateral agreement. Tens of thousands arrived, but the need remained greater than supply. School children were recruited during summers, filling baskets with strawberries or detasseling corn. The Women's Land Army trained thousands of volunteers, many from cities, who learned to drive tractors and wield pitchforks. Still, the shortage persisted. Then, in a stroke of pragmatic calculation, the army looked inward, to the prisoners of war now filling hastily constructed camps across the nation. By July 1943, nearly 100,000 German soldiers had arrived on American soil, captured in Tunisia and North Africa. They were idle, housed in barracks, consuming rations. The Geneva Convention of 1929 allowed their labor, provided it was not dangerous, humiliating, or directly tied to military operations. Agricultural work fit perfectly. Thus was born one of the most unusual wartime labor programs in history: enemy soldiers, under guard, deployed to save the American harvest. Farmers were skeptical at first. Letters to county boards voiced concerns. Were the Germans dangerous? Would they sabotage machinery? Would they refuse to work? And most importantly, could neighbors stomach the sight of Nazis bent over their fields? The War Department reassured them. Contracts were clear. Farmers would not hire prisoners directly. Instead, they would pay the government for each man-hour, at a rate set slightly below prevailing wages. The money went to the U.S. Treasury. The POWs themselves received credit, 80 cents per day, redeemable only at camp canteens for cigarettes, soap, or writing paper. This arrangement preserved the appearance of fairness without placing hard currency in enemy hands. By late summer 1943, the program was underway. Tens of thousands of Germans, clad in denim uniforms stenciled PW across the back, began boarding buses each morning, travelling from camps to farms, orchards, and canneries. The effect was immediate. In Nebraska, 1,500 POWs thinned sugar beets, saving a crop worth millions. In Michigan, Germans climbed ladders into apple orchards, filling baskets under the watch of both guards and curious farm families. In Texas, they picked cotton in blistering heat, some laughing that the work was harder than any battlefield. By 1944, nearly 90,000 German prisoners were engaged in agriculture across the United States, forming a silent, unseen army of labourers who sustained the home front. For the prisoners of war themselves, the experience was bewildering. They had expected punishment, deprivation, isolation. Instead, they found themselves transported into the rhythms of rural America. Obergefreiter Dieter Scholz recalled, "At first I believed it was a trick. We were given tools, placed among civilians. Children watched us, sometimes laughing. The farmers treated us as if we were workers, not enemies. I thought, surely the guards will shout, will beat us. But they did not. They simply told us to work. Some prisoners resisted, dragging their feet, muttering about dishonor. But hunger and boredom proved persuasive. Work meant exercise, fresh air, and often extra food. It also meant contact with ordinary Americans, whose quiet efficiency challenged Nazi caricatures. Farmers, too, underwent transformation. Many approached the program reluctantly. Some refused altogether, unwilling to let Hitler's men onto their land. Yet those who did often discovered unexpected results. A farmer in Kansas recalled in a 1946 interview, "They were strong boys, most of them, used to labor. They knew how to handle a hoe. Some even knew machinery, and once we showed them, they were quick to learn. We kept guards nearby, but after a while we didn't worry much. They worked hard, they sweated like the rest of us." The productivity was measurable. One county agent in Minnesota estimated that without POW labor, 1/3 of the potato crop would have been lost in 1944. In Arkansas, cotton gins reported record throughput thanks to German field hands. Still, not everything was smooth. Local resentment sometimes flared. Women whose husbands were overseas bristled at seeing able-bodied young Germans working the fields while American families carried ration books. Town meetings debated whether employing prisoners was fair when civilians struggled with shortages. The War Department countered with statistics. Every bushel harvested by POWs supported the troops abroad. Every acre they tended freed American workers for factories or the front. Posters reminded civilians, "Every prisoner's work strengthens our victory." The Germans, meanwhile, absorbed lessons with every day of labor. They saw barns stacked with surplus wheat, granaries sealed with iron doors, livestock fattened in feedlots. They watched tractors the size of locomotives plow entire fields in an afternoon. Gefreiter Hans Klein later wrote, "I had thought German order was unmatched. But the American farm was more ordered than any place I had known. Machines, silos, storage, all in perfect rhythm. I began to wonder, if this is one farm, how can our Reich compete with such abundance?" By the end of 1943, the experiment was no longer an experiment. It was policy. Tens of thousands of enemy soldiers were part of the American agricultural cycle. They worked sun-up to sundown, returned under guard, and slept behind barbed wire. But during the day, they saw, and helped sustain, a nation whose abundance mocked the scarcity of their homeland. The agricultural labor shortage had forced America to adapt. In doing so, it provided German POWs with a window into a society that contradicted everything they had been told. And as 1944 approached, the contradictions only deepened, for the prisoners would soon discover that in America, food was not only plentiful, it was a weapon of ideology. September 1943, Nebraska. At dawn, the German prisoners were marched into the beet fields. Their boots sank into dark, rich soil, soft with irrigation. For hours they bent to pull the heavy roots, piling them high. Sweat dripped, muscles ached. Yet what astonished them was not the labor. They were soldiers, accustomed to toil. What astonished them was the sight of food everywhere, in quantities beyond imagination. The fields were endless, a sea of green stretching to the horizon. Trucks rumbled past, already half filled, bound for processing plants. At the edge of the field, bins overflowed with harvested beets, waiting to be loaded. One prisoner muttered, "In Germany these would be guarded like gold." Here they lie unprotected more than anyone could steal. The contrast was brutal. In Germany, food was scarcity, ration books, lines stretching down blocks. A 1942 ration card allowed 50 grams of butter a week, 200 grams of meat, 250 grams of sugar. Coffee was gone, replaced by roasted barley. Bread was padded with potato flour, sometimes sawdust. Even soldiers on the front received meagre portions. Black bread, thin soup, horse meat if lucky. Here, in America, food spilled over. Barns filled with corn until the walls bulged. Silos stored grain in such abundance that some farmers sold it for feed. At midday, farmers' wives brought lunches into the fields, thick ham sandwiches, jars of cold milk, apples shining in the sun. For Germans accustomed to hunger, it was almost an insult. One POW whispered, "This is not food for men. This is food for kings." The statistics told the story. In 1943, American farmers produced over 100 billion pounds of milk, more than 4 billion bushels of corn, nearly 24 billion pounds of meat. German production, battered by bombing and conscription, fell year after year. By 1944, many German civilians survived on less than 1,500 calories per day, while American soldiers overseas received rations of 4,000 calories. The prisoners felt this difference in their bodies. Within weeks, many gained weight. Their cheeks filled out, their uniforms tightened at the belt. American guards joked that POW camps were the only units in the army where the enemy grows stronger. It was not only quantity, but quality. POWs recalled the shock of tasting whole milk, fresh from the farm, after years of watered-down substitutes. Apples so plentiful that farm children bit into one, ate half, and tossed the rest away. Bread made of pure wheat flour, soft and white, unlike the dark, coarse loaves of wartime Germany. Unteroffizier Ernst Müller remembered his first sandwich. 2 slices of bread as white as snow, butter so thick it left marks on your teeth, ham stacked until it bulged. I thought of my wife and children. At home they stood in line for hours for one loaf. Here a child ate more in a day than my family had in a week. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Nazi propaganda had insisted that America was chaotic, its people soft and wasteful. But the prisoners saw that the waste itself spoke of overwhelming strength. A society that could feed its children, its soldiers, its prisoners, and still have grain left for livestock was not weak. It was powerful beyond measure. Some prisoners of war grew angry. Why do they have so much while our people starve? Others fell into silence, staring at the orchards heavy with fruit, the hogs fattened on cornmeal, the cream poured into churns. A few began to question. If America could feed the world, perhaps its victory was inevitable. Letters home, censored but revealing, carried fragments of this truth. Prisoners wrote of fresh milk, of pie at harvest time, of barns so full they seemed to burst. Families in Germany could hardly believe it. One wife later recalled, "He wrote that even the animals ate bread finer than what we were given. I thought it was a lie, until after the war I saw it myself." Food abundance became its own weapon of ideology. Every sandwich, every apple, every overflowing silo contradicted Hitler's vision of a decadent, collapsing America. The Germans had been taught to see strength in sacrifice. Now they saw a different kind of strength, one born of machines, soil, and an industrial democracy that could outproduce the Reich 1,000-fold. And with every bite, the illusion of Nazi supremacy weakened. October 1943, Iowa. The German prisoners were marched back from the fields at dusk, tired but not broken. Dust clung to their boots, shirts damp with sweat. Yet what remained in their minds was not the labour, but the human encounters, moments that Nazi ideology had assured them would never exist. They expected to be treated as enemies, despised and humiliated. Instead, they met farmers who shook their hands, women who served them meals, and children who watched them with curiosity rather than fear. These small gestures became acts of quiet revolution, dismantling years of propaganda. The Geneva Convention had required fair treatment, but America went further. By 1943, labour shortages had drawn more than 200,000 German prisoners onto American farms. They dug beets in Nebraska, picked cotton in Texas, harvested apples in Washington. Farmers paid their wages through the War Department. Prisoners earned credits that could be spent at camp exchanges. Yet beyond the contracts and regulations, a social relationship formed in the fields. Guards often relaxed their vigilance. In rural towns where escape was pointless, rifles rested on shoulders rather than at the ready. Farmers offered water from their own wells, food from their own tables. In Wisconsin, a group of German prisoners was invited to join a harvest supper. They sat alongside American families, eating roast chicken and pumpkin pie, the same meal served to everyone. One prisoner later wrote, "I had believed that Americans hated us." But the farmer's wife smiled as she filled my plate. It was the first time since capture that I felt like a human being, not just an enemy. Nazi propaganda had warned that Americans were mongrels, rootless, greedy, incapable of discipline. Yet in the Midwest, the Germans saw communities bound by church, school, and harvest. They saw farmers rising before dawn, working as hard as any soldier, producing food not for conquest, but for sustenance. The cultural shock was profound. American children carried schoolbooks and lunch pails, not swastika flags. Women drove tractors while their husbands served overseas. Sunday services filled wooden churches, where hymns rose in English accents that sounded foreign yet familiar. For men raised on the doctrine of racial hierarchy, this equality was unsettling. A farmhand, a shopkeeper, and a bank owner might stand together at the same church pew, pray the same prayers, eat the same potluck dinner. To the German eye, it appeared disorderly, yet it worked. The encounters became more personal with time. Many prisoners picked up English words from farmers' children. They learned the names of crops, tools, and meals. Some taught German songs in return. In Kansas, a POW recalled teaching a farm boy to count to 10 in German, while the boy taught him to skip stones across a pond. Romance was forbidden, but whispers circulated nonetheless. Young women noticed that many prisoners were blonde, fit, and polite. Letters and memoirs decades later revealed guarded flirtations, a smile across the fence, a ribbon passed secretly. Nothing official, but enough to challenge the image of absolute enmity. The impact of kindness rippled through the prison camps. At Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners organized concerts and theater productions. Local civilians were invited to attend. For Christmas 1944, the POWs built a life-sized nativity scene, complete with wooden figures carved by hand. Thousands of townspeople came to see it. In those moments, the line between enemy and neighbor blurred. Not all encounters were peaceful. Some Americans resented the sight of well-fed Germans while their own sons fought overseas. There were incidents of hostility, rocks thrown, harsh words shouted, editorials condemning coddling the enemy. But over time, practical necessity softened anger. The Germans worked hard, filled labor shortages, and behaved with discipline. Respect replaced suspicion. For the prisoners themselves, these encounters cut deeper than any lecture or leaflet. They had been told that Americans were decadent, weak, and divided. Instead, they found families who shared food, guards who allowed dignity, and communities that integrated them into the rhythms of daily life. Lieutenant Hans Schneider later testified, "I realized then that what we had been told in Germany was all lies. These people did not hate us. They treated us with fairness, even kindness. I began to ask myself, if America can be strong and yet merciful, what kind of future could Germany have if we continue to believe in hate?" The humanization of the enemy ran both ways. For many Americans, the German POWs were the first Germans they had ever met. They saw not faceless Nazis, but young men, often no older than their own sons, polite and industrious. Farmers discovered they could trust the prisoners with tools, even with livestock. Children sometimes followed them in the fields, asking questions. By 1945, the perception of the POWs had shifted. What began as fear of dangerous captives evolved into something else, a recognition that shared humanity could outlast wartime enmity. The cultural encounters of 1943 to 45 left a permanent mark. When the prisoners returned to Germany, they carried stories not of cruelty, but of kindness. They remembered the taste of pumpkin pie, the sound of hymns in small-town churches, the laughter of children who had never known hunger. In post-war interviews, many confessed that these moments, more than any textbook or lecture, transformed their worldview. They had been treated not as conquerors or criminals, but as men, and that dignity became a seed for the democratic values they would later embrace. November 1943, Kansas Wheat Country. The bus carrying German prisoners jolted to a stop beside a broad open field. In the distance, machines growled, steel monsters crawling across the prairie, belching dust and grain. The prisoners filed out under guard, eyes fixed on the spectacle. A single combine, painted green and yellow, moved through acres of wheat, devouring stalks with spinning blades, spitting kernels into a trailing truck. Unteroffizier Karl Weiss, who had studied agriculture in Saxony, stared in disbelief. In Germany, 50 men would work for a week to harvest what this machine takes in one afternoon. The contrast between German and American farming methods was staggering. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American agriculture as backward, a land of small, inefficient farms run by unskilled workers. The reality was mechanization on a scale unimaginable in Europe. By 1943, the United States had nearly 1.5 million tractors in operation. Germany, after years of war and fuel shortages, had fewer than 120,000, many idle from lack of gasoline. American factories turned out 150,000 tractors annually, even during wartime restrictions. Mass production ensured not only abundance but standardization. Machines with interchangeable parts, easily repaired, designed for efficiency. The prisoners learned these figures not from textbooks, but from the evidence before their eyes. Barns filled with machines, fields managed by handfuls of men. The American combine became a symbol. Built by companies like John Deere and International Harvester, these machines cut, threshed, and collected grain in a single motion. German farms, still reliant on hand scythes or horse-drawn binders, required armies of labourers to accomplish the same task. Prisoners soon realised the deeper implication. If America could harvest grain with machines, it freed men for war. Every tractor was another soldier available for the front, every combine a battalion of labourers made unnecessary. One POW later explained to Allied interrogators, "We understood then that we could not win. Germany required every able man in the field. America needed only a few. The machines fought alongside them." At first, many Germans mistook the scale for waste. They watched silos overflowing, trucks lined along roads, grain poured almost carelessly. Yet over time they recognized the system behind the apparent excess. Cooperative elevators pooled grain from dozens of farms. Railroads whisked carloads of wheat to mills hundreds of miles away. Standardized sacks, storage bins, and even inspection stamps ensured that grain met quality standards before shipping. The efficiency was industrial, not agricultural. American farming was less about tradition, more about engineering. The POWs, many of whom came from rural backgrounds, felt the difference keenly. In Bavaria, a farmer measured success in bushels from his family plot. In Iowa, success was measured in tons per acre, shipments per rail car, contracts fulfilled. The farm was not merely subsistence but business, a link in a national chain of production. Captured documents later confirmed the shock. German reports from interrogated POWs noted, "The scale of American farming exceeds anything in the Reich." Their mechanization permits enormous output with minimal labor. We underestimated this factor. Encounters with American farmers deepened the lesson. Farmers explained, sometimes proudly, the horsepower of their tractors, the width of their plows, the capacity of their combines. They showed prisoners catalogues from machinery companies, pages filled with models, prices, and accessories. To the Germans, it was as if farm equipment were as common as shoes. POWs accustomed to scarcity were astonished. In Germany, even horseshoes were rationed, steel reserved for tanks. In America, steel built plows, balers, even refrigerated trucks to haul milk. These observations reshaped German thinking about power. They had believed that strength came from discipline, from sacrifice, from willpower. But here they saw another form: strength through productivity, through machines that multiplied human effort 100-fold. The prisoners also realized that mechanization explained American abundance of food. Ice cream, Coca-Cola, candy bars, all required sugar, milk, corn syrup, cocoa. These commodities were produced at industrial scale, not only meeting demand, but exceeding it, so plentiful that even enemy captives received them. One German wrote after the war, "We thought America's wealth was exaggeration. Then I saw one man driving a tractor that replaced 50. I understood then why our people starved while their prisoners ate cake." For American guards and farmers, the lessons were unintentional. They were simply working their fields, keeping up with the demands of war. But for the Germans, every machine became an argument, every field a lecture. Nazi ideology had declared America chaotic and decadent. Mechanized farming proved the opposite, a society organized around abundance, powered by technology, able to fight a global war without starving its own people. By the end of 1944, many POWs had memorized the names of American machines: John Deere, Case, Alice Chalmers. Some sketched diagrams in notebooks, hoping to carry the knowledge home. After the war, these men would become advocates for modernization in German agriculture. They had seen the future in American fields, and they would bring it back to rebuild their homeland. December 1943, Iowa. Snow dusted the fields where the German prisoners had worked through summer and fall. The tractors sat idle, draped in frost, while barns groaned with stored corn and hay. For the first time since capture, the cycle of American farming slowed. Yet instead of silence, the prisoners encountered something new: holidays, celebrated with a scale and generosity as alien to them as the mechanized harvests had been. The first surprise came at Thanksgiving. In late November, the prisoners were marched into the mess hall of their branch camp, expecting the usual meal of bread, soup, perhaps a small portion of meat. Instead, the tables overflowed. Roasted turkey, bowls of potatoes whipped smooth with butter, loaves of bread white and warm, pumpkin pies crowned with cream. Guards explained the tradition. Thanksgiving, a national holiday, meant feasting in gratitude for the harvest. To the Germans, it seemed absurd. In the Reich, where rations grew tighter each year, a harvest festival meant speeches, propaganda parades, and thin portions of cabbage stew. Here it meant eating until one could eat no more. Unteroffizier Hans Richter, who had grown up on a Hessian farm, later wrote, "I remember looking at the pies. Whole tables of pies, as if no one worried about sugar, cream, or flour. In Germany, those were treasures. Here they were decorations for a holiday meal." Christmas deepened the impression. American families sometimes invited POW labourers to share holiday meals, under guard, but welcomed nonetheless. The sight was unforgettable. Homes strung with electric lights, trees glittering with glass ornaments, stockings stuffed with candy and fruit. Children tore open packages wrapped in coloured paper, gifts piled high beneath the tree. For men whose children in Germany received carved wooden toys, if anything, the abundance was overwhelming. Letters from home spoke of shortages. "We have not seen oranges in years." Yet in America, oranges appeared in every Christmas stocking, exotic fruit distributed as casually as candy canes. Even in the camps, the War Department authorized extra rations for Christmas. Red Cross records confirm that POWs received roast beef, coffee, fruit cake, and even chocolate. To the prisoners, it was a revelation that even the enemy's captives shared in holiday abundance. Lieutenant Ernst Huber later testified in a post-war interview, I realized then the war was lost. A nation that feeds prisoners cake while fighting on two oceans cannot be defeated. Seasonal rhythms extended beyond holidays. In spring, the prisoners saw planting, fields furrowed with tractors pulling drills that sowed evenly, precisely. In summer, they sweated through harvests of wheat and corn, machinery devouring acres by the hour. In fall, they helped with apples, potatoes, sugar beets, each crop a reminder of American variety. And in winter, they watched farmers repair machines, plan the next year, celebrate holidays without fear of hunger. The rhythm was relentless, but it was also reassuring. Food would come again, not through sacrifice or state decree, but through an industrial cycle as dependable as the seasons. The statistics reinforced the visual evidence. In 1943, US wheat production reached 1.1 billion bushels, corn surpassed 3.1 billion, and livestock numbers swelled. 83 million hogs, 61 million cattle. Even with millions of men overseas, farms increased yields through mechanization and fertilizers. Meanwhile, German agricultural reports showed steep decline. Wheat yields falling by 40%, cattle herds cut in half, fertilizer scarce, tractors idle for lack of fuel. The Germans in America lived that contrast daily. They pulled beets from fields too vast for memory, then read letters from wives describing shortages of butter, bread stretched with barley, ersatz coffee brewed from acorns. The holidays sharpened the psychological blow. America could afford to celebrate abundance. Germany celebrated survival. A Nazi propaganda sheet might declare victory through sacrifice. But in America, victory came with feasts, lights, and gifts stacked high under trees. One prisoner later recalled, "I stopped believing the propaganda that called Americans decadent. If this was decadence, then decadence was strength. They had so much that even waste was a luxury." Our families at home rationed potatoes. Their children threw away cake. For American farmers, the presence of POWs during the holidays was routine. They were labourers, nothing more. But for the Germans, every season was a lesson in scale, and every holiday a reminder of defeat measured not just in battles, but in calories, machines, and lights strung across a snow-covered house in Iowa. The rhythms of American life, planting, harvest, celebration, became as powerful a revelation as the battles they had lost. And beneath the glitter of Christmas ornaments and the glow of Thanksgiving feasts, many prisoners grasped the same conclusion. America's strength was not only military, but cultural and economic, woven into the very seasons of its people. Spring 1944, Nebraska. The bus that carried German prisoners to the fields no longer rattled with silence. The men had grown used to the routine. Guards at the back, rifles slung carelessly, prisoners chatting in low voices about crops, weather, and the day's work. They no longer felt like cargo. They felt like hired hands, part of a cycle larger than the war. The strangeness lay not in the fields, but in the faces that met them. American farmers who, at first, had stared at them with suspicion, now offered nods of recognition, sometimes smiles. The lines between captive and neighbour blurred in ways no Nazi instructor had ever prepared them for. The Geneva Convention framed the structure. Prisoners could work, earn credits, and receive fair rations. But it did not account for what happened when work created familiarity. Over shared labour, respect grew. Farmers discovered the Germans were diligent. They knew how to fix harnesses, sharpen tools, tend livestock. Many had grown up on small plots in Bavaria or Saxony, their knowledge practical and precise. They worked as if the farm were their own, one Iowa farmer later recalled. Some of them were the best hands I ever had. In turn, prisoners discovered Americans were neither cruel nor decadent. They were hard-working, pragmatic, and, most astonishingly, trusting. Guards sometimes let the prisoners walk unescorted between fields and barns. More than one German was handed a pitchfork, an axe, or even the reins of a tractor without hesitation. Small acts of kindness began to accumulate. A farmer's wife would hand a prisoner a glass of cold milk on a hot afternoon. Children left apples on fence posts. Guards, once stern, grew casual, sharing cigarettes or stories. At Camp Algona, Iowa, a farmer organized Sunday picnics where German POWs played soccer matches against local boys. Spectators cheered both sides. The competition mattered less than the laughter and the strange fact that enemies could chase the same ball across the same field. Nazi officers had warned the men never to fraternize. Some prisoners still clung to ideology, glaring at guards, refusing food that seemed too American. But the majority adapted. The daily contact with families, ordinary people who showed neither hatred nor fear, softened edges that propaganda had hardened. A Nebraska farmer described the change. At first they were stiff, marching in lines, barely looking at us. By the end, they'd wave when they saw us in town. Some even sang while they worked. The bond deepened during moments of crisis. In Kansas, when a tornado ripped across farmland, German prisoners helped herd cattle, repair fences, and clear debris. They worked all night beside us, the farmer remembered. I forgot they were prisoners. They were just men helping men. In Michigan, when a farmer fell ill during harvest, POWs volunteered to work double shifts, ensuring his crops were brought in. Later, his wife baked bread and pies for the prisoners, smuggling them past the guards. "It was the least I could do," she said. The barbed wire that separated camp from community became, in practice, symbolic more than real. Guards knew escape was pointless, the distances too vast, the locals too watchful, but even more powerful than geography was trust. Many Germans had no desire to flee. They were safer here than in bomb-shattered cities back home. Letters from Germany told of destruction, Hamburg burned, Berlin under nightly raids, rations shrinking. In contrast, American farms were steady, abundant, peaceful. "Why run from bread to starvation?" one POW remarked. These relationships left indelible marks on both sides. Farmers remembered the prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as men with names, stories, and skills. Some corresponded after the war. Decades later, reunion letters passed between Iowa barns and German villages. "You fed me when I was far from home," one former POW wrote to his host family in 1955. "I have never forgotten." For the Germans, the experience was transformative. Many returned home with altered views of America. They had seen kindness where they expected cruelty, equality where they expected chaos. They carried back not only agricultural knowledge but memories of human connection. One prisoner, reflecting in 1985 at a Pacific Theatre veterans reunion, summarized it simply. "It was not the tractors or the food that changed me, but the people. A farmer who trusted me with his cows, a woman who gave me milk, a child who asked me to teach him German words. In those moments, I stopped being a soldier of Hitler. I became just a man. Thus, across fields and barns, in kitchens and picnics, behind barbed wire that slowly lost its meaning, enemies became neighbors. And in the slow work of planting and harvesting, the human bonds that formed did what propaganda could not. They redefined what it meant to be German in America, and what it meant to be American to the enemy." Summer 1944, Minnesota. The war raged across oceans, but on American farms it seemed distant, except when the news arrived. German prisoners, bent over fields of sugar beets or rows of corn, lived in an odd suspension. Labouring under a foreign flag, surrounded by abundance yet still tethered to battles thousands of miles away. The tie was the radio. Farmers listened while milking cows or sharpening tools. Guards tuned in during night watch. Even the camps piped in broadcasts. The prisoners caught fragments, names of places, victories, defeats, Normandy, Rome, Saipan. Each word carried weight, even when delivered in a language they struggled to follow. The War Department monitored what news POWs could access. Official camp bulletins posted translations of major events, sanitized, factual, but impossible to soften. Rome falls to the Allies. Invasion at Normandy. Red Army advances in Ukraine. For the Germans, the headlines were jolts of reality. Letters from home confirmed the grim picture. Paper-thin envelopes arrived months late, censored and blacked in places. They told of ration cuts, air raids, fathers gone, mothers waiting in lines for hours. Some prisoners wept openly upon reading them. Others folded the letters neatly, slipped them into pockets, and said nothing. In the fields, the war intruded in subtler ways. Farmers often spoke of sons overseas. One might mention a boy flying bombers out of England, another serving with the Navy in the Pacific. The Germans listened in silence, thinking of their own comrades, of names scratched on dog tags now lying in North African sands or Russian snows. For the Americans, mentioning sons was pride. For the Germans, it was a reminder. They too had left comrades behind. Yet the contrast stung. American sons fought abroad while fathers harvested with tractors. German sons fought abroad while fathers starved on farms with no fuel or fertilizer. Rumours circulated quickly through the camps. News of the Normandy landings in June 1944 spread within hours. Some prisoners refused to believe it. Others whispered that it meant the Reich was doomed. Guards overheard heated debates. One faction clung to faith in Hitler, the other spoke cautiously of defeat. Captured diaries confirm these divisions. A sergeant from Württemberg scrawled, "If the Allies are in France, then the war cannot last long. But the officers tell us victory is certain. I no longer know what to believe." The distance of war was most painful when air raid reports surfaced. In August 1944, a farmer read aloud that Warsaw and Hamburg had been bombed. A prisoner from Hamburg collapsed in the field, muttering his wife's name. The guards let him sit by the fence until he steadied himself. No one spoke. At night, men gathered in barracks, trading memories of home. They pieced together maps from scraps of news, marking Allied advances with charcoal on cardboard. Each move of the front felt like a tide inching closer to their families, even as they sat safe in America. For the Americans around them, victory seemed inevitable. Newspapers carried photographs of Eisenhower, headlines of advancing armies, statistics of planes built and ships launched. For the Germans, inevitability was a word they dared not speak aloud, yet felt in their bones. Still, some clung to propaganda. They insisted the Allies would fracture, that German technology, the V-weapons, the secret jets, would reverse the war. Guards listened patiently, often amused, but said little. Time itself dissolved those illusions. The war at a distance reshaped the psychology of captivity. Early in 1943, many Germans dreamed of release after victory. By late 1944, those dreams shifted. They now feared what awaited in defeat. Would their homes exist? Would their families survive? What would become of Germany itself? American abundance sharpened these fears. Every full plate of food, every silo stuffed with grain, was a reminder of the contrast with letters describing hunger at home. Prisoners could not reconcile the two worlds, one where cake was served at Christmas, another where bread was rationed by ounces. And yet, paradoxically, the distance from the front offered safety. In interviews decades later, former POWs admitted relief. "I did not have to see Stalingrad," one confessed. "I did not have to see Normandy. I was in Iowa, feeding cows. It was captivity, but it was survival." By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war at a distance had left deep marks. The German prisoners knew the front only through echoes, radio static, censored letters, newspaper clippings pinned to bulletin boards. They had laboured in abundance while their families endured devastation. This duality, safety in captivity, fear for those at home, would become one of the defining memories they carried back across the Atlantic. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was ending. In the American countryside, the German prisoners sensed it before the official announcements arrived. Farmers spoke in low voices about the fall of Berlin. Guards walked with newspapers folded under their arms, headlines visible even without translation. Hitler dead. Germany surrenders. For the prisoners, the news struck like a physical blow. Some had believed until the last moment that Germany's armies would rally, that secret weapons would save the Reich. Others had long accepted the inevitable but felt hollow hearing it confirmed. Around campfires and in barracks bunks, men muttered questions none could answer. What would become of their families? What would remain of their towns? And most urgently, when would they be sent home? Camp life changed almost overnight. The guards grew more relaxed, the once rigid schedules easing as military necessity faded. Farmers, too, treated the prisoners differently. No longer enemy soldiers, they became simply workers, men who had laboured in fields and barns for 2 seasons and would soon depart. In some towns, families who had hired prisoners hosted farewell meals. Oral histories from Kansas and Nebraska record farmers inviting groups of POWs to share fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pie before returning to camp. These gatherings were not officially sanctioned, but the guards looked the other way. The war was over. Humanity could be shown openly. Prisoners, for their part, struggled with the contradictions. They had worn the enemy's uniform, yet American households had fed them. They had seen children who once clutched candy bars now running to wave goodbye. The ideological lines blurred, leaving confusion where certainty had once been. The US Army, bound by the Geneva Convention, now faced the massive task of repatriating nearly 370,000 German POWs. The process could not be immediate. Ships were scarce, transport networks congested with demobilizing American troops. Many prisoners were informed that they would first be sent to Britain or France for labour duty before final release to Germany. The announcement sparked frustration. Men who had dreamed of stepping directly onto German soil after years abroad now faced more months, even years, of delay. In Camp Algona, Iowa, one prisoner reportedly shouted during roll call, "We are no longer soldiers." Why are we kept? The guards had no answer. Yet not all reacted with anger. Some feared the journey home more than captivity. Rumours of destruction, entire cities reduced to rubble, railways shattered, food almost non-existent, circulated through the camps. "In America, we had too much," one Bavarian prisoner later recalled. At home, they said, there was nothing. For many, the hardest part was leaving the farms. Prisoners who had spent long months working alongside American families found the separation emotional. A Missouri farmer's daughter, interviewed in 1983, remembered prisoners carving wooden toys for her as parting gifts. "They said they had daughters at home," she recalled. "They wanted me to remember them." Farmers reciprocated with small tokens, photographs, letters of recommendation, even packets of seeds to take back across the Atlantic. These gestures, modest though they were, symbolized bonds that wartime politics could not erase. Some prisoners tried to preserve contact. They wrote down farm addresses, promising to write after the war. Many did. Archival collections in Germany and the US contain bundles of correspondence between former POWs and American families, letters exchanged across oceans for decades. The preparations for return sharpened the contrast between captivity and freedom. On the one hand, the prisoners longed for their homeland, their families, the language and landscapes of childhood. On the other, they knew that what awaited was a wasteland of bombed-out cities, scarce food, and political uncertainty. One former Africa Corps soldier summarized the dilemma in a post-war memoir. "We went home with full stomachs to people who had not eaten. We went home healthy to families who were sick. We went home alive, but not without guilt. This guilt permeated the barracks in the final weeks. Men whispered of wives they had not seen in 5 years, of children who might not even recognize them, of parents whose survival was doubtful. The laughter that once echoed after long days in the fields grew rare. The war's end meant joy, but also reckoning. By summer 1945, trains began to carry the first groups of prisoners eastward. They boarded under guard, but the atmosphere was no longer hostile. Guards shook hands, farmers waved from platforms, children pressed candy into the prisoners' hands for the journey. The departing Germans looked out train windows at the vast American countryside, fields heavy with harvest, silos brimming with grain. They had worked in this abundance, tasted its plenty, and could not forget it. Many scribbled quick notes in diaries. America is rich beyond words. We saw what industry can do when used for food, not weapons. They did not know when, or if, they would see this land again. But the memory of American farms, of tractors humming across endless rows, of families who fed even their enemies, would accompany them back across the Atlantic. The preparations for return were not merely logistical, they were psychological. They marked the moment when prisoners shifted from wartime adversaries to potential bridge builders in post-war Europe. What they had seen in the fields of Iowa and Nebraska, in the barns of Texas and Minnesota, would shape their expectations for Germany's future. When asked decades later what they carried most vividly from captivity, many answered not with memories of barbed wire or guards, but with images of farmland in harvest, tables laden with food, and the kindness of American families. The departure in 1945 was an end, but also a beginning, of a long process in which former enemies became witnesses to abundance and eventually participants in rebuilding a shattered continent.